Morning. Hope you're doing well today. If you're a regular member of St. Peter's, and please don't forget to reply to the WhatsApp messages that I've been sending about the possibility of restarting a 10 o'clock service on Sundays in the church building in mid-September, which we hope, if we're able to do that, would restart with our annual service of remembrance. The details are all in the WhatsApp messages, and whether you would plan to be part of those services or not, it would really help us to know how many people are expecting to come and how many people would not be wanting to come at this stage. So please just take a moment to reply to that over the next couple of days, and that would be really helpful. I want us to think about for a moment all those experiences that we go through at different points that can seem endless when we're in the middle of them, particularly the difficult experiences. Think about when you're revising for important exams, how you seem to be doing so for this inordinate period of time that is never going to stop, that it feels like you're going to be spending the rest of your life combing through books and making notes and trying to memorize things. Think about when you're staying up all night on a night shift, if that is part of a job that you've ever had, when it feels like at different parts of the night that the night will never finish, that you'll never see the sun on the horizon, that you'll never get to go back home and have a rest. Think about a dominant sports team like perhaps the All Blacks, who feel like they'll never ever lose another game. Think about an oppressive government or regime or empire that just feels impregnable, impossible to stop, impossible to bring down. But they do all end. They may feel endless when you're in the middle of them, but all those things finish, they stop. Nothing made by people, which as those things all are, ever lasts forever. Exams eventually come and then they go. The morning comes and you get to go home and to go to bed. The sports team loses a game and they fail to win a championship. The oppressive regime, the empire, falls. These things feel unending when you're in the middle of them, but they do eventually end. And that's where we are, what we're thinking about in Daniel chapter 2 today. The people of God continue to be in exile in Babylon, as we were thinking about last week with chapter 1 of this book in the Old Testament. And in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon at this stage, is disturbed, unable to sleep, upset because he's been having dreams that are scaring him and that he doesn't understand. And none of the people who are supposed to help him in this situation are able to do so. They're not able to tell him what these dreams are about. And he gets so angry and disturbed by this situation that he tells his advisors that if they're unable to give him a meaning to these dreams, that he will have them killed and their families destroyed. And they're unable to do so. So he makes good on his threat, and he gives the order for the advisors, the wise men, to be killed. And that includes Daniel and his friends, who we started to think about last week, because they have risen to this point of influence in the kingdom, in the court of the king of Babylon. And just as they're about to come and take Daniel and his friends away, he asks, look, what's going on? What's provoked the king to do this? And it's explained to him about the dreams, and he talks with his friends, and they pray, they beg God for insight and mercy. And then they go to the king. They tell him what he's dreamt, because God has told them what he has dreamt. And they then give this interpretation. And the interpretation is that his kingdom will fall, and that the kingdoms that come after his will fall. And Nebuchadnezzar is so astonished by all this that he pays Daniel honor, verse 46, and rewards him, gives him an even higher position and lots of gifts, and makes him ruler over an entire province, and places him in charge of all the staff and officials working in that province. And Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, are given positions of influence also, whilst Daniel remains in the royal court. There are significant echoes it occurred to me of Joseph's story here. We have the man of God who is in a foreign country under a foreign king serving in the court. We have a foreign king who's disturbed by dreams, and we have the man of God able to understand those dreams and give an interpretation, and when he does so successfully, he's rewarded with a position of influence in that foreign kingdom. Last week we reflected that Daniel and his friends, of course, were willing in exile to study what verse 1 refers to as the language and literature of Babylon. That he didn't dismiss it as unholy or ungodly, as something he wanted nothing to do with, but he was willing to study it and learn it, take part in it, and really get to grips with it. And it seems that that is part of what enables Daniel to speak with what the narrator of this book calls in verse 14 of chapter 2, wisdom and tact. He understands the kind of undertones of what's going on here. He has been studying the culture and the way Babylon does things for so long now that he can pay attention. He gets this, so he knows how to communicate and how to handle this situation. And as he does so, he then begs God. He says to God, what is going on here? What are these dreams? And God then comes with the seemingly miraculous supernatural gift of both the knowledge of what the dreams are and the understanding of what those dreams mean. Daniel, as he did last week, remains respectful. He doesn't try to undermine the king. He doesn't try to disturb the system. All he does is be God's person in that place at that time, studying the language and literature, being part of the royal court, serving the king, helping the king, but still pointing to God. And the result is astonishing. You'd expect, I think, the king, when he's told that his empire is going to fall, you would expect the king to react angrily. But he doesn't. He recognizes the truth, even though he has nothing to do with Daniel's God, our God. And the king is moved by that. He is thankful for that. He recognizes truth because Daniel has recognized and honored truth and he knows that Daniel is not trying to bring him, the king, down, but is trying to serve him, that he is not a troublemaker, but rather he is someone who has gained a good reputation in the court. So when he is called upon to speak by God with authority to present this challenging truth to the king, it's one he is able to present that the king hears, even though it's a difficult and potentially painful thing to hear. And that's an important point to note before we carry on. It's very easy in any situation as God's people to want to challenge the world around us and point out this that's wrong and that is wrong. And of course, sometimes that must be done. But it needs to be done in this sort of way that Daniel does, when we have earned the right to speak and shown that we love the community and the people around us. That we are not simply trying to bring things down and make everything the way we want them to be, but to be people of good reputation, of good standing, who have learnt the language and literature of the culture in which we live, and can speak God's truth to that culture, even when it's painful to hear, but who are heard not as underminers, but as people who have sought to be a blessing, sought to be good news, sought to be the people who we referred to last week in Jeremiah 29, verses 4-7, who make their home in the city of exile and establish themselves there and are a blessing to the prosperity of that place of exile, even as it is foreign to them. We earn the right to speak the difficult stuff to the culture, because we've shown that we also love the people and the community and the culture around us. We could also apply that to people, couldn't we? That we don't just tell people that they're wrong, but we love people and we serve people, so that when and if we do have to say that you got that wrong, or you really shouldn't have done that, then that has a potential of being heard by the person who's done wrong, as coming from someone who's actually looking out for their best, who has served them and loved them and blessed them in the past. So we move on. So the dream which Daniel interprets for the king is this profound reminder, statement, that power belongs to God, the God of Daniel, our God. True power. And every kingdom, every empire of human beings eventually falls, even when they look permanent, even when they look like they'll never end, they do have an end that is coming. And this is part of the really big theme of the book of Daniel, even when it moves into the slightly stranger seeming visions and pictures that we get towards the end of the book. The ultimate power and authority belongs to God, and that his is the only power and authority that will last forever. God's power will be established, and we as Christians now call that the kingdom of God. And as I've said so many times in the past, that the Bible's understanding of God's kingdom is not necessarily about a geographical nation state as such, but it's any place where God's will is done. And how is God's will done? Well, it's done through his people, through you, through me, through anyone following Jesus, serving God. It's established in and through us. Like through Daniel and his friends here in chapters 1 and 2, learning the language and literature of the culture, serving the people, listening to them, establishing themselves in the language of Jeremiah 29:4-7. Be in God's place, in that place at that time. Living well, being of good reputation, being those who seek the best for that city, that culture, and who are ready to speak challenging truths to it and live in a challenging way when the time comes. Who, to use a New Testament language, are ambassadors of God. Note the kingdom language of being an ambassador. That is how God's kingdom is established. That is how we remind ourselves that every empire, every system, every oppression, every suffering will fall and come to an end. Because only God's power, only God's kingdom, which is for the good of humanity and for his glory, which brings an end to all suffering, which is about the freedom from oppression, which is about the blessing of the poor, which is about the healing of the sick. All of that is the only thing that will last forever, the only power, the only system, the only authority that will last. All powers, all other empires will fall. So we as God's people live wisely and well whilst we're in the midst of these seemingly endless but ultimately bound to fall powers. Not compromising who we are as God's people, but being a positive presence wherever possible, so that we influence in the small details, the micro, and in the macro, the bigger picture. And the macro is really the seemingly small detail of one life. Not many of us will be Daniels or Josephs who rise to a position of significant influence in a city or a country. But if you and me living well in the culture in which we live, and influencing and serving and blessing one other person who doesn't know God, if that's what we do, then that's influence on a big scale. Because if we influence one for the good, and that other person then goes on to influence another two, and those two go on to influence another two each, for it grows and grows and grows, and the yeast of God's kingdom eventually spreads throughout the loaf. What are you facing that seems endless and oppressive? What is our culture, what is our world facing that seems endless and oppressive? It will stop. It will stop. Because it's not from God. But God's good kingdom of liberation, freedom, provision and healing will never be defeated, will never end. And we get to start expressing that and experiencing it here and now. Amen.